April of 1884. The stage from Laramie set Margaret Shaw down at the crossroads called Bitter Hollow with a carpetbag, a folded newspaper advertisement, and 40 cents to her name, and she had read that advertisement so many times on the journey that the ink had worn pale at the creases. It asked for a cook only, a woman of plain habits and steady hands to keep house and kitchen for a widowed rancher and his help through the spring branding. It said nothing of a wife, and Margaret had answered it the way a drowning woman answers a rope, which is to say without asking where the rope was tied. She was 26, and she had buried more than most. A father gone to fever, a mother gone after him, a brother who had gone west and simply stopped writing, the way the West swallowed men whole and sent back no echo. She had cooked in a boarding house in Laramie until the boarding house closed, and then she had cooked for a hotel until the hotel hired a man at half her wage, and she had learned that a woman with skill and no family was a thing the world used up and set down empty. So when the advertisement promised wages and a roof for honest kitchen work, she packed what fit in one bag and told no one, because there was no one left to tell. The man who came for her drove a buckboard with a patient gray mule and a worse temper than the mule, or so she judged from the set of his jaw. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, early 30s, with tousled dark hair under a tan wide-brim hat and a short dark beard going to dust at the edges. His eyes were gray-blue and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He looked at her carpetbag and then at her, and then he said the first thing he ever said to her. "You're smaller than I hoped." "And you're ruder than I feared," Margaret answered. "So we're each disappointed, and we can stop pretending otherwise." Something moved behind his eyes that was almost a smile, and decided against it. "Tom Bellamy," he said, "the ranch is the Three Pines. It's 9 miles. There's a creek between here and there that floods if the snow melts high, so if you're going to faint, do it before the water and not in it." "I have never fainted in my life," Margaret said, climbing up beside him without his hand. "And I do not intend to begin in front of a man who insults my size before he's learned my name." He clicked his tongue at the mule. The buckboard rolled, and for 2 miles he said nothing at all, and Margaret watched the country open out around her, the long tan grass run into blue hills, the cottonwoods marking the creek like a green seam stitched through the brown. And she told herself she had cooked for worse men than a rude one. A rude man at least told you where you stood. The Three Pines was a low log house with a deep porch, a barn that listed slightly east, a bunkhouse, and 3 actual pines standing sentinel by the well, which she supposed answered the question of the name. Tom Bellamy carried her bag inside without being asked and set it by the kitchen, and the kitchen was the first thing she had seen all day that made her heart lift. It was a real kitchen, with a good iron range and a deep hearth, and a long pine table scrubbed pale, and a window over the basin that looked west to the hills. "The last cook left in February," he said. "Took the silver spoon my wife was buried with, too, but I don't expect you'll want to hear about that." "Your wife," Margaret said carefully. 2 years gone. Lung fever." He said it flat, the weight of it already settled into habit, already past the place where saying it hurt. "There's me and 3 hands, Cobb, Henry, and the boy Asa. You cook for 5. You keep the house. I pay $8 the month, and you eat what we eat. That's the whole of it. That's the whole of it, she agreed, and she did not let her face show what $8 a month and a roof meant to a woman with 40 cents. A starving woman who shows her hunger gets fed less, not more. She had learned that, too. That first evening, she found a side of bacon, a sack of flour gone slightly weevily at the bottom, dried apples, beans, coffee, and a crock of sourdough starter that someone had kept alive through neglect the way some things insist on living. She fed the weevily flour to the chickens, sifted what was clean, and by full dark she had set down on that long pine table a supper of fried bacon, white beans cooked with onion, and a little molasses, and a pan of sourdough biscuits risen high and gone gold at the tops. The three hands ate like men who had forgotten food could be a thing you looked forward to. Cobb, a gray-mustached old hand with a stiff hip, ate 4 biscuits and apologized for none of them. The boy Asa, who could not have been 16, ate until Margaret quietly moved the pan nearer his plate. And Tom Bellamy ate in silence at the head of the table, and when he had finished, he looked at the empty biscuit pan a long moment. And then he looked at her, and the tired in his eyes had shifted into something she could not name. "How long?" he said. "Till those biscuits are cool enough to wrap for the morning?" "They're not for wrapping," Margaret said. "I'll make fresh at dawn. These are gone tonight by the look of your men." "How long till they're cool?" he said again, and there was a strange insistence in it. If a man wanted to take one out to the porch and think. "A quarter hour, maybe," she said. "Less in this cold." He nodded once, as if she had told him something of great consequence, and he took his coffee out to the porch and sat in the dark while she cleaned the kitchen, and the cold came in under the door, and the pines stood black against the first stars, and the house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in a long time. She rose in the black before dawn and built the fire and set the dough, and by the time the window had gone gray, she was pulling the first pan from the oven, and Tom Bellamy was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat already on, which meant he had not slept, or had slept very little, and had been waiting. "Miss Shaw," he said. "They're not cool yet," she said without turning. "Give them a—" "Marry me." The pan nearly went into the fire. Margaret set it on the iron with hands that had gone, for the first time in years, unsteady, and she turned and faced him across the warm kitchen, with the steam still rising off the biscuits between them. "You will explain yourself," she said, "and you will do it quickly, because I have been awake since 4, and I am holding a very hot pan." "I didn't advertise for a wife," he said, "because no decent woman answers an advertisement for a wife from a man she's never seen, only the desperate kind, or the lying kind, and I've had my fill of both. I advertised for a cook, because a cook I could judge by her work in a day, and I watched you yesterday." He took off the hat, which she would learn he did only when he meant a thing entirely. "You fed weevils to my chickens instead of my men. You moved the pan toward the boy without a word, so he wouldn't have to ask and shame himself. You climbed up beside me without my hand, and you gave me back exactly as much rudeness as I gave you, no more. Margaret, I have a ranch, and 3 good men, and a dead wife's silence in every room of that house, and I have not wanted to come in from the cold to any of it in 2 years. And last night I came in and the house smelled like bread, and somebody had moved the boy's plate, and I sat on that porch, and I wanted to be inside it. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," Margaret said very slowly. that you proposed marriage to a woman before her biscuits had cooled on the strength of one supper and a sack of weevily flour. Yes, he said, I'm aware of how it sounds. It sounds, she said, like a man who decides too fast and regrets at leisure. It sounds, he said, like a man who has learned to judge the thing in front of him because he's a rancher, and a rancher who can't judge goes broke. I'm not asking you to love me, Miss Shaw. I'm asking you to stay and keep this from being a house I dread, and in exchange, I'll give you my name, which means my land, which means nobody ever uses you up and sets you down empty again. And there it was, the thing she had not said to a living soul, said back to her by a stranger across a pan of cooling bread, as if he had read it off her the way she'd read the weevils in the flour. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the gray was going gold over the hills. The biscuits steamed. No, she said. His face did not fall so much as close. He put the hat back on. All right. The cook's wages stand. I said no to today, Margaret said. I did not say no forever. You will court me like a Christian man, Tom Bellamy, through the spring and the branding and however long it takes. And I will cook your suppers and watch whether the man who reads a woman in an hour is also a man who respects what he read through a year. And if at the end of it I still find you rude, I'll take my wages and my own name and go, and you'll have lost nothing but the price of the advertisement. Those are the terms. For the first time since the crossroads, Tom Bellamy smiled, and it changed his whole tired face. How long, he said, till I can carry one of those out to my men and tell them who baked it? Since I'm to court you patiently, I'd best start somewhere, and bread seems a safer place than marriage. A quarter hour, Margaret said. Don't let them cool completely. They go stiff. So began the courting, and it was not the courting of the picture books, because there were no picture books at the Three Pines, only work. The spring branding came, and the dust hung over the corrals for a week, and Margaret cooked 3 meals a day for 8 men, with the rope and iron smell of it in her hair, and she learned the country and the men and the slow particular language of a man who said little and meant all of it. She learned that Tom Bellamy rose before his hands and worked harder than any of them, and never once raised his voice, except to the mule. She learned that the boy Asa was an orphan Tom had taken on against the advice of every rancher in the valley, because the boy had nowhere, and that old cob's stiff hip came from a fall Tom had pulled him out from under and never mentioned. And she learned the trouble, because there is always a trouble, and the trouble at the Three Pines wore a silver watch chain and a black frock coat, and was named Halloran. He came on the second Sunday, a heavy silver-haired man on a tall black horse with 2 riders behind him, and he did not get down. "Bellamy," he said, looking past Tom to the house, to the barn, to Margaret on the porch with a dishcloth in her hands. "I heard you took a cook. I heard worse, that you mean to make her a wife and breed yourself an heir for this dirt." He smiled the way a foreclosure smiles. "I'll save you the trouble. Your note at the Cattleman's Bank comes due in September. $400. You won't make it, not after the hard winter killed your calf crop, and when you don't, the Three Pines runs into my range, and I won't even have to dig up your fence posts." He touched his hat to Margaret with grotesque courtesy. "Ma'am, pity to cook for a dead ranch." Margaret did not answer him. She had learned a long time ago that you do not waste your fear on a man on a tall horse. You take his words into the kitchen, and you do your sums. And that night, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, she sat down across the long pine table from Tom Bellamy with the ranch ledger she had asked for open between them, and she ran her cook's finger down the column of figures, and she said, $400 by September. I know what I owe, Tom said. You owe more than you know, Margaret said, because you keep your figures the way a man keeps a wound, by not looking at it. Sit down. We're going to look at it. And she showed him line by line where the money bled, the supplier in Laramie who overcharged him for flour and feed because Tom was too proud to haggle, the calves sold early and cheap in autumn for ready cash when held to spring they'd have brought near double, the wages he paid old Cobb out of pity that the ranch could ill afford, and that Cobb would have died before accepting a charity if he'd known. You can read a person's character before you've learned their name, Margaret said quietly, but you cannot read your own books, and the difference between this ranch living and dying is $200 of arithmetic you've been too grieved to do. Tom Bellamy looked at the ledger for a long time. Charlotte kept the books, he said at last, my wife. After she died, I couldn't open the cover. I just paid what they sent and signed what they put in front of me. Then I'll keep them, Margaret said, if you'll have me keep them, not as your cook, as your partner in the arithmetic, until September, and we'll see if a ranch can be saved by a woman who reads Weevils and Worth and figures all three. She paused. That is not the same as marrying you. It is only the part of marrying you I am sure of. I'll take the part you're sure of, Tom said. So through the long, bright summer, that ranch ran on 2 pairs of hands and 1 sharp pencil. Margaret cut the dishonest supplier loose and dealt instead with a Laramie merchant who respected a customer that checked the weights. She held the calves. She turned the kitchen garden, which had gone to weed after Charlotte died, back into rows of beans and squash and turnips that meant the ranch bought less and ate better. She sold eggs and butter and the high golden sourdough loaves to the Bitter Hollow store until the store could not keep them, and the country knew, before it knew anything else about her, that the woman at the 3 Pines baked the best bread in the valley. By August, she had a tin box behind the flour barrel, and in the tin box she counted every Sunday what they had against what they owed, and every Sunday she said the number out loud to Tom Bellamy across the long pine table, and every Sunday the number was less. $240 short, she said, in the first week of August. 190 the second. 110 the third, after the butter and the bread and a fair price on the spring lambs. $60 short, she said on the last Sunday of August, with the September note due in 11 days and the held calves not sold yet. Halloran's been to the bank, Tom said. Cobb heard it in town. Halloran's offered to buy my note off them outright, so when it comes due, it's him I owe and not the bank. And a bank will give a man grace, and Halloran never gave anything grace in his life. He turned his hat in his hands. If we're 60 short on the 9th, Margaret, he forecloses the next morning, and there's no judge in this county he doesn't own. Margaret looked at the number in the tin box. $60. 11 days. She had stood closer to the edge than this with less, and she had learned that the edge is a place where you stop counting what you've lost and start counting what you still have in your 2 hands. Then we sell the calves at Laramie, she said. Not to Halloran's man who'll quote you a robber's price, knowing you're cornered, but at the railhead pens to the eastern buyers, where the price is set by the market and not by your enemy. It's 2 days' drive each way. We'd have to start tomorrow. She closed the tin box. And we'd have to bring the best of the held calves, the fat ones, and you'd have to let me come and keep the figures, because a buyer who thinks he's dealing with a grieving widower in a hurry will cheat you, and a buyer who's looking at a woman writing down every word he says will not. They drove the calves to Laramie in the first week of September, Tom and Cobb and the boy Asa, and Margaret on the buckboard with the ledger and the tin box. And they came to the railhead pens where the eastern buyers stood in their town coats among the bawling stock. And the first buyer took one look at the dusty rancher and named a price $4 a head under the market, the way a man tests whether you know what you're worth. And before Tom could open his mouth, Margaret Shaw stepped down off the buckboard with the ledger against her chest and said, in a voice that carried across the pens, "The Kansas City quote came over the wire to the Laramie Depot this morning at $9.40 the hundredweight, sir, and these calves will weigh out near 400 pounds. And I have written down the number you just said in front of 3 witnesses, so you may either name me the wire price or name me your name and the name of the house you buy for, because I mean to write to them about how their man does business." There was a silence at the pens. The buyer looked at the woman with the book, and at the men behind her, and at the calves, which were fat, and he named her the wire price, to the half-cent, and he took off his town hat when he did it. They came home to the Three Pines on the second Sunday of September with the tin box full and $40 over the note besides, and Tom Bellamy laid the bank's stamped receipt on the long pine table, paid in full and a day early, and the foreclosure that Halloran had bought died on the desk of a clerk who had been told to expect a beaten man and instead received a woman's arithmetic. Halloran came one last time, the following Sunday, and again he did not get down off the tall black horse. He looked at the painted barn that had been mended, and the garden in full bearing, and the calf money plain on the prosperity of the place, and he could not foreclose on any of it, and he knew it. "You got lucky, Bellamy," he said. "I got married," Tom Bellamy said, which surprised Margaret as much as it surprised Halloran, because he had not yet asked her the second time, and she stood on the porch with the dishcloth in her hands and let the lie stand, because it was not going to be a lie much longer, and they both knew it. Halloran turned the black horse and rode out of the story, and that was the last the valley saw of his courtesy or his contempt. That evening Tom Bellamy came into the kitchen as the light went gold over the western hills, and Margaret was pulling a pan of sourdough biscuits from the oven, risen high and gone gold at the tops, the same as the first night. A whole season turned around between the two pans. He took off his hat. "Marry me," he said, "not because I'm cornered, and not because the house is cold, though it was both. Marry me because I read your worth in a day and I was right, and a man who's been right about the one thing that mattered most in his life would be a fool to let it carry its own bag down off that buckboard. I'll wait, if you need me to wait. I've learned to wait." Margaret set the pan on the iron. The steam rose between them. Outside, the Three Pines stood black against the gold. "How long?" she said. "Till those biscuits are cool enough to wrap." "A quarter hour," Tom said. "Less in this cold." "Then you have a quarter hour," Margaret said, to find old Cobb and the boy and tell them whose name this kitchen keeps from now on, because I'll not have you proposing to me twice and me saying yes with no one to witness it. The answer is yes, Tom Bellamy. It was yes in August, if I'm honest, somewhere around the time the number in the tin box got smaller than my doubt. But you'll get your witnesses, and you'll get them before the bread is cool, since you seem to do all your important business by the cooling of my biscuits." And he laughed. The boy from the bunkhouse would say afterward he'd never heard Tom Bellamy laugh like that, not once in 2 years. And he went to fetch his men, and the biscuits had not cooled before the kitchen of the Three Pines was full of people, and Margaret Shaw, who had come west with a carpet-bag and 40 cents, and the certainty that the world used women up and set them down empty, married the rude man who had read her worth across a pan of bread, with old Cobb and a half-grown orphan boy for witnesses, and the smell of sourdough in the air. They were married 3 weeks later by a circuit preacher under the Three Pines, and Margaret kept the books of the Three Pines for 41 years, and the ranch never again came within $60 of any man's foreclosure. The supplier in Laramie, who had overcharged a grieving widower, learned to send honest waits. The boy Asa grew up and took land of his own 2 valleys over and named his eldest girl Margaret. And the valley, which had once bet that a cook from a newspaper advertisement would not last the branding, came in time to say that the Three Pines had been saved not by the man who owned it, but by the woman who could read worth in a sack of weevily flour, the same as he could read it in her. If this story stayed with you, sit with it a moment before you go. The world is full of people who decide who we are in the first minute, too small, too plain, too poor, too easily used up. And now and then, the great mercy of a life is the one person who reads us right when everyone else read us cheap. So tell me, have you ever been completely wrong about someone in the very first minute, the way Margaret was wrong about a rude man on a buckboard, or the way that rude man was exactly right about her? Leave it below. I read every one. And if you'd like another story about the people the frontier underestimated and the moment the world finally saw them true, there's one waiting for you right here.